December 7th, 1941. 6:05 a.m. aboard the aircraft carrier Shokaku, sailing north of Oahu in the cold Pacific dawn. The wind cuts across the flight deck in sharp bursts, snapping signal flags and rattling loose equipment. The deck crew crouch low as the first Mitsubishi A-6M20 fighters warm their engines. The radio motors cough, then roar to life one after another, the sound vibrating through the steel deck like distant thunder. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stands near the island tower, binoculars pressed against his face. His breath forms faint clouds in the freezing morning air. Around him, the strike force prepares with precise discipline that has taken years to build. Below him, dozens of pilots sit inside cockpits polished to mirror brightness. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya checks the gauges of his Zero fighter. Oil pressure steady, fuel mixture correct. The Nakajima Sake engine vibrates beneath him with the smooth confidence of a machine built for war. Nearby, Lieutenant Kakuichi Takahashi climbs into his Aichi D-3A1 Val dive bomber. Ground crew finish loading the 250-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage. Each man on this deck has survived a training system so brutal that only a tiny fraction of candidates ever reach this moment. Years earlier, at the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Station in Tsuchiura, young cadets had begun the process. Out of hundreds of applicants, perhaps 20 would graduate. Flight instructors drove them relentlessly. Landing practice until midnight. Formation, flying in violent coastal winds. Navigation by dead reckoning over open ocean. One mistake could mean expulsion. 2 mistakes meant disgrace. The Japanese Navy believed that a pilot must be more than trained. He must be perfected. Commander Fuchida lowers his binoculars and looks across the deck. These men are not simply pilots. They are weapons. The philosophy of the Imperial Japanese Navy is simple. A single elite aviator is worth dozens of ordinary ones. The United States, in contrast, trains pilots through large standardized programs. Their flight schools accept thousands of candidates. Training is faster, broader, less selective. To Japanese officers, this approach seems crude. Mass production may work for factories, but not for warriors. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands inside the carrier's operations room, studying a map illuminated by dim red lights. 6 carriers make up the strike force: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. Together, they carry more than 400 aircraft. But it is not the number that gives Nagumo confidence. It is the men flying them. These aviators have spent years mastering carrier operations. Night landings, long-range navigation, coordinated strikes. Their instructors demanded perfection because the Japanese Navy cannot easily replace them. Training a carrier pilot requires nearly 3 years. Fuel, aircraft, experienced instructors, all limited resources. But Japanese strategists believe this investment guarantees victory. The United States may build ships quickly, but it cannot create pilots like these. At least that is the belief. A deck officer raises a signal flag. Engines increase to full power. The first Zero begins rolling forward. Lieutenant Itaya pushes the throttle. The fighter races across the deck wheels, bouncing over seams in the metal surface. At the edge of the carrier, the aircraft lifts into the sky and vanishes into the pale morning light. One after another, the strike aircraft launch. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters. Within minutes, the entire wave forms into tight formations heading south toward Pearl Harbor. Commander Fuchida watches the last aircraft disappear into the clouds. Behind him, a young signals officer speaks quietly. "Sir, all aircraft have launched." Fuchida nods slowly. He has no doubt about the outcome. The Americans are unprepared. Their Pacific Fleet sits at anchor. Battleships lined neatly along Battleship Row. No combat air patrols, no alert fighters. The elite aviators now flying toward Hawaii will destroy the fleet in a single morning. But what matters most to Japanese commanders is something deeper. These pilots must survive. Each one represents years of training. Each one carries knowledge that cannot be replaced quickly. In Japanese doctrine, the preservation of elite pilots is a strategic priority. Victories must be achieved without unnecessary losses. Because once these men are gone, they cannot easily be replaced. Across the Pacific at that exact moment, the United States Navy operates very differently. At Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, Young American cadets begin their day with basic flight drills. Hundreds of trainees fill the airfields. Stearman biplanes buzz over the coastline. Training is systematic, standardized, efficient. The goal is not perfection. The goal is numbers. Thousands of pilots, thousands more, every year. American planners assume that war will consume pilots at terrifying speed. Their response is simple: replace them continuously. Industrial thinking applied to aviation. But in 1941, Japanese commanders see this as weakness, quantity over quality, machines over warriors. And so, on the cold Pacific morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy launches its elite pilots with supreme confidence. They believe they possess the finest aviators on Earth. They believe every loss matters. They believe skill will defeat numbers. For now, the sky belongs to them. Commander Fuchida climbs into his own aircraft as the second wave prepares. The attack on Pearl Harbor is only the beginning. In the months ahead, Japanese carrier pilots will sweep across the Pacific with terrifying effectiveness. At Pearl Harbor, at the Coral Sea, at the Indian Ocean, elite aviators will sink battleships, destroy carriers, and dominate the skies. But hidden inside this early success is a quiet vulnerability. The training pipeline that produced these men is small, slow, exclusive. Every pilot lost will be nearly impossible to replace. At this moment, no one on the carrier decks believes that weakness will matter. Victory seems certain. The best pilots in the world are now in the air, and the war has only just begun. April 18th, 1942. 8:24 a.m. Flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Japan. The sea is rough rolling in long gray swells that slam against the hull of the carrier. Wind tears across the deck, whipping the jackets of sailors who stand frozen in disbelief at what sits before them. 16 North American B-25B. Mitchell bombers line the narrow flight deck. Medium bombers, land-based aircraft, planes never designed to operate from a carrier. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stands beside the first aircraft, his gloved hand resting against the cold aluminum skin of the bomber. The engines already rumble with deep mechanical growls. Behind him, Captain Mark Mitcher, commander of the Hornet, studies the ocean horizon through binoculars. Japanese patrol boats have been spotted earlier than expected. The mission cannot wait. Mitcher lowers the binoculars. "We launch now." Doolittle nods once and climbs the ladder into the cockpit. Inside, the cramped bomber co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole adjusts his headset. The engines roar louder as the throttle advances. The bomber begins rolling forward. There are only a few hundred feet of deck. If the aircraft fails to lift in time, it will plunge directly into the Pacific. Sailors step aside as the bomber accelerates. Wind slams against the wings. The nose lifts. For a moment, the heavy bomber seems to hesitate at the edge of the deck. Then it rises into the air and climbs away. One after another, the remaining bombers follow. Within minutes, 16 American bombers are flying west toward Japan. Across the Pacific, Japanese air defense radar stations detect nothing unusual. The idea that American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands seems impossible. Japanese planners believe their defensive perimeter extends thousands of miles across the Pacific. Their carrier pilots dominate the skies. Their naval aviation elite is undefeated. The attack that follows shocks the entire empire. Shortly after noon, American bombers appear over Tokyo. Air raid sirens scream through the city. Civil defense crews scramble. Imperial Japanese Army fighters attempt to intercept, but the B-25 bombers drop their bombs quickly and disappear into cloud cover. The damage is limited. Several factories are hit. Some warehouses burn. Civilian buildings are damaged. But the psychological impact is enormous. Tokyo has been bombed. For the first time since the war began, Japanese commanders realize something deeply unsettling. The enemy can reach them. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, senior officers gather around maps spread across a long wooden table. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, listens quietly as intelligence officers present their analysis. The attack itself is not the greatest concern. What troubles Yamamoto is the implication. The American Navy is adapting faster than expected. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air planner who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, studies the reports carefully. He speaks calmly. If the Americans can launch bombers from carriers, they can strike anywhere. Several officers dismissed the idea immediately. The B-25 raid was reckless, a propaganda stunt. The bombers will never return to their carriers. The crews will likely crash in China, operationally meaningless. But Yamamoto understands something deeper. The United States does not think like Japan. The Imperial Navy protects its elite aviators carefully. Losses are minimized whenever possible. Every trained pilot is precious. But the Doolittle raid proves the Americans are willing to risk aircraft and crews for strategic impact. They can afford to, because behind every American pilot stands a vast training system already expanding. Across the United States, new airfields are appearing almost overnight. Texas, Arizona, California, Florida. Hundreds of training aircraft fill the skies every day. Primary training, basic training, advanced gunnery schools, navigation training, carrier qualification. The system operates like a factory. Pilots move through standardized stages. If one fails, another takes his place. If 10 are lost in combat, 10 more graduate the following month. Japanese intelligence officers know about these programs, but they underestimate the scale. Inside Japanese naval aviation, the training philosophy remains unchanged. Only the best candidates are accepted. Only a small number can pass. The result is extraordinary skill. Japanese carrier pilots regularly outperform opponents in dogfights. The Mitsubishi R-6M0 flown by these elite aviators dominates early combat across the Pacific. But this excellence hides a dangerous imbalance. The training system produces only a few hundred pilots each year. Losses cannot be replaced quickly. Still, most Japanese officers believe this will not matter. They expect the war to be short. A decisive battle will destroy the American fleet. Negotiations will follow. Victory will be secured before pilot shortages become a problem. Admiral Yamamoto proposes a bold plan. The American carriers must be destroyed. Without carriers, the United States cannot threaten Japan's defensive perimeter. The target will be Midway Atoll, a small island in the Central Pacific, but strategically vital. If the American carriers defend Midway, they will be exposed. Japanese carrier aviation will destroy them. The elite pilots who crushed Pearl Harbor will deliver the final blow. Preparations begin immediately. Carriers assemble. Aircraft are loaded. Pilots briefed. Many of the aviators preparing for the operation are the same men who attacked Pearl Harbor only months earlier. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itiya, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, Lieutenant Kakuichi Takahashi, veterans, masters of carrier warfare. But even now, small cracks are appearing. During recent battles in the Coral Sea, Japanese squadrons have lost experienced aviators. Some aircraft fail to return, others ditch at sea. Each loss removes years of training. Each empty cockpit weakens the force slightly, yet the victories continue. American ships sink. Japanese carriers survive. Success hides the warning signs. Inside briefing rooms aboard the carriers, Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu pilots study their attack plans. Confidence remains absolute. They believe skill will always triumph. They believe elite training guarantees superiority. They believe the Americans cannot replace pilots fast enough to matter. But somewhere beyond the horizon, American carrier groups are already moving toward Midway. And inside those carriers, new pilots continue arriving. Not perfect, not elite, but trained quickly and ready to replace the next man who falls. June 4th, 1942, 9:20 a.m. The Pacific Ocean, northeast of Midway Atoll. The flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi vibrates beneath the thunder of engines warming for launch. The smell of aviation fuel hangs thick in the humid air as deck crews move quickly between rows of aircraft. Dive bombers sit armed with 250-kilogram bombs. Torpedo bombers wait with long Type 91 torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages. Fighter escorts sit ready at the forward end of the deck. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands inside the dim command bridge studying incoming reports. Sweat forms along his collar despite the circulating fans overhead. An officer hands him a radio message from a reconnaissance aircraft. An American fleet has been sighted. Carriers are likely present. Nagumo's jaw tightens. This is the battle Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto predicted. The decisive clash that will destroy American naval aviation. But something unexpected has already happened. Japanese strike aircraft launched earlier that morning to bomb Midway Island encountered fierce resistance. American fighters rose from the island in desperate defense. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of exploding shells. Several Japanese aircraft failed to return. Others limped back to the carriers, riddled with bullet holes. Still, the damage to Midway appears incomplete. The airfield remains operational. Nagumo faces a difficult decision. His aircraft are currently armed for land attack. Bombs are loaded instead of torpedoes. If American ships are nearby, the strike force must be rearmed. Inside the hangar decks below, crews begin a complicated operation. Bombs are removed. Torpedoes brought forward. Fuel lines run across the floor. Aircraft wings folded tight in crowded rows. Japanese carrier operations are precise but delicate. Rearming and refueling takes time. Above the carrier formation, fighter patrols circle in the clear blue sky. Among them flies Lieutenant Saburo Shindo in his Mitsubishi A6M20. He scans the horizon carefully while adjusting the throttle. Japanese pilots have dominated the air for 6 months. In the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, over the Coral Sea. Their skill has made the Zero nearly untouchable. But suddenly, distant shapes appear low over the water. Dark silhouettes approaching the fleet. American aircraft. Torpedo bombers. They fly slow and low, barely above the waves. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron leads Torpedo Squadron 8 from the aircraft carrier, USS Hornet. 15. Douglas TBD. Devastator torpedo bombers approach the Japanese fleet without fighter escort. The Devastator is already considered obsolete, slow, poorly armed, but the pilots press forward. Saburo Shindo pushes his Zero downward in a steep dive. Japanese fighters swarm the American formation like hawks descending on prey. Machine guns flash. The sky erupts with streaks of tracer fire. One Devastator explodes into flames. Another plunges into the sea. Waldron's aircraft continues forward despite the chaos. He holds the formation steady as long as possible. Then his plane is hit. It erupts into smoke and disappears beneath the waves. Within minutes, every aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8 has been destroyed. Only one man survives. Ensign George Gay floats in the water, clinging to a life raft, watching the battle unfold around him. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots, the fight confirms everything they believe. American aircraft are poorly coordinated, poorly protected. Their pilots lack skill. The Devastators were slaughtered before reaching torpedo range. More American squadrons arrive. Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise. Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown. Again, they attack without fighter escort. Again, Japanese fighters intercept them. Zeros tear through the formations with devastating efficiency. American aircraft burn across the sky. Torpedoes fall harmlessly into the ocean. The Japanese fleet appears untouchable. On the carrier decks below, officers watch the battle through binoculars. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda turns to an operations officer. "The American torpedo planes are brave," he says quietly, "but they are foolish." To Japanese observers, the battle seems to confirm their doctrine. Elite pilots defeat inferior opponents. Training matters more than numbers. But above the Japanese fleet, something unexpected is unfolding. Because the Zero fighters are busy chasing the torpedo bombers far below the carrier formation. Their attention is fixed on the low-altitude attack. Their fuel gauges begin to drop as they continue the pursuit. And high above the battle, unseen in the bright morning sky, another group of aircraft approaches. 33 Douglas SBD. Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier, USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey. For nearly an hour, McCluskey searched the ocean after losing contact with the Japanese fleet. Fuel levels are dangerously low. Then he spots a lone destroyer racing north at high speed. The destroyer, Arashi. It had just finished depth charging an American submarine and is now returning to the fleet. McCluskey understands immediately. Ships do not move like that unless they are rejoining something important. He turns the formation toward the destroyer's wake. The dauntless bombers climb higher, 20,000 feet above the ocean. Their engines hum steadily as they approach the Japanese carriers. Below them, the Japanese fleet remains focused on the torpedo attacks. Fighters low on fuel begin returning to the carriers. Hangar decks remain crowded with fueled and armed aircraft waiting for launch. The Japanese believe they have already defeated the main American strike. But now, at the worst possible moment, the dive bombers arrive. Lieutenant Richard Best banks his Dauntless forward. Through the clouds, he sees them. 4 Japanese carriers sailing in tight formation. Akagi. Kaga. Soryu, Hiryu. At this exact moment, the balance of the Pacific War hangs in the air above them, and the men diving toward those carriers are not elite veterans. Many are newly trained American pilots, graduates of the rapidly expanding training programs back home. They are not perfect, but there are many of them, and more are already on the way. June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. Above the carrier formation of the Imperial Japanese Navy, northeast of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey pushes the nose of his Douglas SBD Dauntless forward. The aircraft shudders as gravity begins to pull it downward. The dive brakes snap open with a metallic jolt, slowing the bomber just enough to keep it controllable as it drops from 20,000 feet. Wind screams past the canopy. Below him, the carrier Kaga grows larger every second. Across the sky, dozens of American dive bombers follow. The attack arrives with terrifying precision. Only minutes earlier, Japanese fighter pilots had been circling low over the ocean chasing the last of the American torpedo bombers. Their Mitsubishi A6M20 fighters now scrambled desperately to climb back toward the carriers. But they are too late. The dauntless bombers fall out of the sun. On the deck of Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Kusumi looks upward as the first shadows sweep across the ship. For a moment, he cannot understand what he is seeing. Then the sky fills with diving aircraft. Alarms erupt across the carrier. Anti-aircraft guns begin firing wildly. Shell bursts tear black holes through the sky, but the bombers are already too close. Lieutenant Richard Best targets the carrier Akagi. Through the gun sight of his Dauntless, he sees the long wooden flight deck stretching across the carrier's length. Aircraft crowd the deck while crews rush to prepare the next strike. Best releases his bomb. The aircraft jolts upward as the weapon falls away. Behind him, other bombers release their bombs in rapid succession. Seconds later, the first explosion tears into Kaga's flight deck. A massive column of fire erupts upward as fuel tanks ignite. Flames spread instantly across the tightly packed aircraft. Bomb after bomb slams into the carrier. The hangar decks below are filled with fueled aircraft bombs and torpedoes waiting for launch. Explosions chain together like thunder rolling through a canyon. Kaga becomes an inferno within minutes. Nearby, the carrier Soryu suffers the same fate. 3 bombs strike almost simultaneously. Fire erupts through the hangars. Fuel lines burst. Ammunition detonates violently. The ship's internal corridors fill with smoke and screaming crewmen. Even the flagship Akagi is not spared. Lieutenant Richard Best's bomb strikes near the center of the flight deck. It penetrates deep into the hangar below, where torpedoes and aircraft fuel are stored. A fireball bursts through the carrier's interior like a furnace exploding. Inside the command bridge, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo grips the edge of the chart table as the ship shudders beneath him. For several seconds, no one speaks. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers are burning. 3 of the most powerful ships in the Pacific Fleet, destroyed in less than 5 minutes. On the surviving carrier, Hiryu Captain Tomio Kaku watches the disaster unfold through binoculars. Columns of black smoke climb thousands of feet into the sky. The heart of Japan's naval aviation has been shattered, but the battle is not finished. Hiryu still has aircraft, still has pilots, still has the elite aviators who trained for years to master carrier warfare. Captain Kaku orders immediate retaliation. Within minutes, dive bombers from Hiryu launch toward the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi leads the attack. His formation of Aichi D3, Aval dive bombers, climb steadily toward the American carriers. These are experienced pilots. Many have fought since the opening days of the war. Their skill remains unmatched. They locate the carrier USS Yorktown. Anti-aircraft guns erupt as the Japanese dive bombers begin their attack runs. Kobayashi dives through clouds of exploding shells and releases his bomb. It strikes Yorktown with devastating force. Another bomb follows, then another. The carrier erupts in fire. Smoke pours from shattered decks. But American damage control teams respond instantly. Sailors rush into burning compartments. Hoses spray water through corridors filled with smoke. Within an hour, fires are brought under control. The ship slows but does not sink. Japanese pilots report the carrier destroyed, but they are wrong. Across the Pacific, the difference between the 2 navies is becoming painfully clear. Japanese carriers rely on preventing damage. American ships train constantly to survive it. Soon another Japanese strike launches from Hiryu. torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. They find Yorktown again as the ship struggles to recover. 2 torpedoes strike the carrier's side. Water floods into the engine rooms. The ship finally stops dead in the water. Japanese pilots once again report the carrier sunk. But even now, American sailors continue fighting to save the ship. Meanwhile, American aircraft from USS Enterprise and USS Hornet search for the last surviving Japanese carrier. Late in the afternoon, they find it. Hiryu, the final remaining carrier of the strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers descend once again from high altitude. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher leads the attack. Bombs fall across Hiryu's deck. One explosion after another tears through the carrier's hangars. Within minutes, Hiryu is burning just like the others. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. Hundreds of aircraft lost. Many of Japan's most experienced pilots gone. But the full scale of the disaster is not yet understood. At this moment, commanders still believe the loss of carriers is the greatest blow. They do not yet realize something far worse has happened. The pilots who trained for years to master carrier warfare are dying with their ships. And back in the United States, thousands of new pilots are already moving through training schools faster than anyone in Tokyo imagines. June 5, 1942. 2:40 a.m. Aboard the battleship Yamato flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, hundreds of miles west of Midway Atoll. The ocean is black and silent beneath a sky filled with stars. Only the slow pulse of the battleship's engines breaks the stillness as the massive vessel cuts through the Pacific darkness. Inside the operations room, the air feels heavy and stale. Lamps cast pale light across maps spread across a long steel table. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands motionless beside the chart. Several officers wait quietly. No one speaks. A radio operator removes his headset and hands a message to Captain Matomi Ugaki Yamamoto's chief of staff. Ugaki reads the signal slowly. Then he closes his eyes for a moment. When he finally speaks, his voice is flat. Hiryu has been lost. The room grows completely silent. For several long seconds, the only sound is the distant hum of the ship's ventilation fans. 4 fleet carriers destroyed. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force has vanished in a single day. But Yamamoto's thoughts move somewhere deeper than the ships themselves. Carriers can be built again. Steel can be replaced. Shipyards can work night and day. But the men who flew from those decks are gone. Years of training vanished with them. Inside the dim room, Yamamoto studies the operational chart one more time. The great decisive battle he designed has ended in catastrophe. He understands something that few others in the fleet yet grasp. The Imperial Navy did not simply lose ships at Midway. It lost the irreplaceable heart of its aviation force. The elite aviators who carried Japan through the first 6 months of war are gone. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific, the United States Navy is already absorbing its own losses. In a training field outside Corpus Christi, Texas, rows of training aircraft line dusty runways under the blazing sun. Steerman. Pi-13 biplanes taxi slowly across the airfield. Inside one cockpit, aviation cadet Robert Harris struggles to keep the aircraft steady as an instructor watches carefully from the rear seat. The training program is relentless but efficient. Primary flight training lasts only a few months. Cadets learn basic flight control navigation and emergency procedures. Those who pass move on to more advanced aircraft. Others wash out and are replaced immediately by new recruits arriving from across the country. Hundreds graduate every month. Soon, thousands. American planners designed the system before the war even began. They expected heavy losses. They expected pilots to die. The solution was simple: produce more. At naval air stations across the United States, identical programs operate simultaneously. Pensacola in Florida, Corpus Christi in Texas, Glenview in Illinois, Jacksonville, San Diego. Thousands of cadets train at the same time. The aircraft they fly are not precious prototypes. They are mass-produced trainers. If one crashes, another replaces it the next day. Instructors follow strict manuals that standardize every step. Landing patterns, formation flying, gunnery practice, carrier landings, everything designed to move pilots through the system quickly, not perfectly, but efficiently. Back on the battleship, Yamamoto studies the list of missing aviators from the destroyed carriers. Names fill several pages. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa, commander of the Soryu Dive Bomber Group. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leader of Hiryu's torpedo squadron. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the famous leader of the Pearl Harbor attack, survived the battle only because illness kept him ashore during the operation. Many others did not survive. Men who had trained together for years. Men who mastered the complex art of carrier warfare long before the war began. Each of them represented a rare resource within the Japanese Navy. Training a carrier aviator requires years of preparation. Fuel for thousands of flight hours. Experienced instructors. Carrier landing practice at sea. Japan's limited industrial capacity restricts how many trainees can pass through the system. Before the war, only about 100 naval aviators graduated each year. Even now, the program cannot expand quickly. Fuel shortages, aircraft shortages, instructor shortages, and most importantly, the belief that elite training must remain selective. The Imperial Navy refuses to dilute its standards. Quality must remain supreme. At least that is the belief. But Midway has changed the equation. Because the Americans are not trying to create elite aviators. They are creating large numbers of competent ones across the Pacific. American carrier pilots prepare for their next missions. Many of them are young. Some have less than a year of experience. They are not legends. They are replacements, and behind them stand thousands more still in training. On the bridge of Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto finally speaks. "We must rebuild the carrier force," he says quietly. Ugaki nods. "Yes, Admiral. But both men understand the problem. Even if new carriers are built, who will fly from them? The pilots lost at Midway cannot be replaced quickly. Each empty cockpit represents years of training. Each veteran pilot lost removes valuable combat experience that cannot be recreated inside a classroom. Yet in the months ahead, the war will demand more pilots than ever before. New battles, new carrier operations, long-range patrols across an expanding Pacific battlefield. The Japanese training system must now attempt something it was never designed to do. Produce large numbers of pilots, and do it quickly. But even as these discussions begin inside Tokyo and aboard the fleet, American training bases continue producing graduates at an accelerating pace. Dozens this month, hundreds the next, soon thousands. A quiet imbalance is forming. One side losing elite pilots faster than it can replace them. The other replacing losses almost as quickly as they occur. The consequences of that imbalance have only just begun. August 7th, 1942. 6:45 a.m. Above the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, a humid tropical haze hangs low over the jungle-covered island as engines roar across the sky. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai grips the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M20 fighter. Sweat runs down the inside of his goggles as he pushes the throttle forward. Below him, American ships crowd the waters off Guadalcanal. Transport ships, destroyers, cruisers. The United States has launched a major invasion. Sakai banks sharply as the Zero formation races toward the fleet. Japanese naval headquarters had not expected this. For months after Midway commanders believed the Americans would pause, they expected time to rebuild. Instead, the Americans are attacking again. The target is Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip on Guadalcanal Island. If the Americans keep it, they can launch aircraft directly into the Solomon Islands campaign. Japanese pilots must destroy it. But already something feels different. Inside the cockpits of the Japanese fighters and bombers, the formation contains many unfamiliar faces. The veterans who dominated early battles are fewer now. Many died at Midway. Others were lost in previous operations. Their replacements come from an accelerated training program rushed into operation after the disaster. Lieutenant Sakai glances at one of the younger pilots flying nearby. The man struggles slightly to maintain tight formation in the turbulent air. Sakai recognizes the signs immediately. The pilot lacks experience. Before the war, a Japanese naval aviator often logged more than 700 hours of training before entering combat. Carrier landings alone required endless practice. Navigation over open ocean required mastery. Gunnery required precision. But the new pilots entering combat in 1942 have far fewer hours. Fuel shortages force instructors to shorten training schedules. Aircraft shortages reduce practice flights. The result is a generation of pilots entering battle with limited preparation. Yet the missions continue. Japanese bombers approach Henderson Field. Anti-aircraft guns erupt from the American positions below. Tracers streak upward through the sky. The Zero fighters dive to engage American aircraft rising from the airstrip. Wildcat fighters. Grumman F-4F Wildcats. At first glance, they appear clumsy compared to the elegant Zero. The American fighters are heavier, less maneuverable, but they are rugged. Their pilots fly with a different style. Lieutenant Sakai closes in behind a Wildcat and opens fire. Bullets strike the American aircraft, but the fighter does not burst into flames. Instead, it dives away at high speed. The American pilot uses the aircraft's strength to escape rather than turning to dogfight. It is a new tactic. American pilots have studied the weaknesses of the Zero. Avoid turning battles. Use diving speed. Attack in pairs. These ideas are spreading quickly through American squadrons. And behind every squadron stands something even more important. Replacement pilots. At Henderson Field, American aircraft rotate constantly. Some pilots are veterans of earlier battles. Others arrived only weeks ago. They are not as experienced as the Japanese veterans once were, but they continue arriving. Every time a pilot is lost, another appears. Meanwhile, Japanese squadrons cannot replace losses so easily. Each missing pilot leaves a gap that cannot be filled immediately. Back in Japan, training schools struggle to increase production. Instructors now push students through shorter programs. But the results are uneven. Some pilots graduate with barely half the flight hours once required. Others never complete carrier landing training before being sent to frontline bases. The desperate need for pilots forces commanders to accept risks they once refused. On Guadalcanal, the consequences begin appearing almost immediately. During one bombing mission over Henderson Field, a formation of Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers approaches at medium altitude. American fighters intercept. One of the escorting Zero pilots misjudges a defensive maneuver and collides with a bomber. Both aircraft explode instantly. Another pilot becomes separated from the formation and disappears into heavy cloud. The veteran leaders notice these mistakes. The careful precision that once defined Japanese carrier aviation is fading. In contrast, American aviation grows stronger each month. New aircraft models appear. Improved training methods spread through the fleet. Radar guidance helps fighters intercept incoming raids. But the most important change is less visible. The steady flow of new pilots entering combat. Across the Pacific, American naval aviation schools expand even further. More instructors, more training aircraft, more cadets. The system grows like a vast machine, feeding pilots directly into the war. Inside Japanese command meetings, officers argue about how to respond. Some insist that standards must remain high. Elite training built Japan's early victories. Lowering standards risks destroying the quality that made their pilots superior. Others argue that the war has changed. Numbers now matter more than perfection. But even those who support expansion face harsh reality. Japan lacks the industrial capacity to match American production. Aircraft factories struggle to meet demand. Fuel supplies shrink as Allied submarines begin attacking shipping routes. Even if Japan trains more pilots, there may not be enough aircraft or fuel to train them properly. The imbalance grows slowly but relentlessly. Above Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai fires his machine guns again as another Wildcat crosses his path. The American aircraft dives away toward Henderson Field. More Wildcats appear climbing from the airstrip. More American pilots. The battle continues through the tropical sky. But the veterans like Sakai can already feel it. The war in the air is changing, and Japan no longer controls its pace. October 26, 1942. 7:58 a.m. The Pacific Ocean, north of the Santa Cruz Islands. The carrier, Shokaku, rolls heavily in the morning swells as aircraft engines roar across its flight deck. Thick clouds stretch across the sky, broken only by patches of pale sunlight reflecting off the steel-gray ocean. Flight crews move quickly between aircraft lined along the deck. Aichi, D3, A dive bombers. Nakajima, 5, in torpedo bombers. Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters warming their engines. Captain Masafumi Arima watches the launch preparations from the bridge. His face is calm but tense. 6 months ago, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, this same carrier launched aircraft flown by some of the finest aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many of those men are gone now. Some died at Midway. Others were lost in the brutal air battles over Guadalcanal. The squadrons that remain still include experienced pilots, but their numbers are shrinking. And the replacements arriving from training schools are not the same. Below deck in the ready room, Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto tightens the straps on his flight helmet. He is one of the remaining veterans, a skilled fighter pilot who has survived multiple campaigns. He studies the younger pilots sitting nearby. Some look barely older than cadets. Their uniforms still appear stiff and new. They speak quietly among themselves, their voices carrying the nervous energy of men entering combat for the first time. Iwamoto remembers his own training years earlier. The endless flight drills, precision gunnery practice, hundreds of carrier landings under the watchful eyes of instructors who tolerated no mistakes. The program had been brutally selective. Only a small number of pilots ever reached operational squadrons. That exclusivity once gave Japan its advantage, but now the war demands more pilots than the system can produce. The aircraft launch signal rises. One after another, the strike aircraft accelerate across the deck and lift into the cloudy sky. The target lies somewhere beyond the horizon. An American carrier group. The battle that begins that morning will later be known as the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft have located American carriers. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commands the Japanese carrier force once again. Despite the losses at Midway, Japan still fields several powerful carriers. Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the smaller carrier Zuiho. Their aircraft launch toward the American fleet with familiar precision. Fighter escorts climb above the bombers as the formation moves south. But inside the cockpits, the difference between veterans and replacements becomes immediately clear. The formation spacing is not as tight. Radio discipline is inconsistent. One bomber drifts slightly out of position before correcting. Small signs, but experienced pilots notice them. Far below, American radar operators aboard the carrier USS Enterprise detect incoming aircraft. The radar screens glow inside the dim combat information center. Blips appear across the display. Dozens of them. The American response begins instantly. Fighters launch. Anti-aircraft guns prepare. American naval aviation now operates very differently than it did during the early months of the war. The training programs back home have already begun delivering large numbers of replacement pilots. Squadrons rotate personnel frequently. New pilots arrive regularly. Some lack experience, but they fill the gaps quickly. And they learn fast in combat. Above the Pacific, the two forces meet. Japanese Zero fighters dive toward American Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The sky fills with twisting aircraft and streaks of machine gun fire. Veteran Japanese pilots still demonstrate incredible skill. Lieutenant Iwamoto maneuvers his Zero behind an American fighter and fires a short burst. The Wildcat spirals downward, trailing smoke. But nearby, a younger Japanese pilot hesitates during a maneuver. An American fighter seizes the opportunity. The Zero explodes in a burst of flame. The imbalance appears again and again across the battle. Japanese veterans perform brilliantly, but their numbers are limited, and every loss hurts more. The American squadrons absorb casualties differently. One pilot is shot down, another takes his place. If an entire squadron suffers heavy losses, replacements arrive within weeks. The American system feeds new aviators into the fleet continuously. The Japanese system struggles to keep pace. As the battle intensifies, Japanese bombers reach the American carriers. Dive bombers attack the USS Hornet. Bombs strike the flight deck with devastating force. The carrier erupts in flames. Torpedo bombers follow with deadly precision. 2 torpedoes slam into the ship's side. Hornet becomes crippled in the water. For a moment, it appears the Japanese strike has achieved a decisive victory. But the cost is staggering. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire tear through the Japanese formations. Many aircraft fail to return. Some crash into the ocean with empty fuel tanks. Others are shot down during the retreat. When the surviving aircraft return to the carrier's flight deck, crews count the losses. Dozens of aircraft missing. More importantly, many pilots missing. Several experienced squadron leaders never return. Inside the ready rooms, empty chairs begin to appear. This becomes the true disaster of the battle. Not the loss of aircraft, not even the loss of ships, the loss of trained aviators. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with a carefully constructed system built around elite pilots flying from powerful carriers. That system required time to train replacements, time that no longer exists. Meanwhile, American naval aviation grows stronger every month. More carriers are entering service. More aircraft roll off factory assembly lines. More pilots graduate from training schools. The balance of the war in the air is shifting. And even when Japan wins tactical victories, the cost is becoming impossible to sustain. By the end of the battle, the carrier Hornet will sink beneath the Pacific. But Japan's air groups will never fully recover from the losses suffered that day. The original plan of the Imperial Japanese Navy was simple. Elite pilots would destroy the American fleet quickly. Victory would come before industrial production, and pilot training could shift the balance. But that plan is now collapsing, because the war is no longer being decided by the best pilots. It is being decided by the side that can replace them. November 1943. 5:10 a.m. Naval Air Training Base at Tsuchiura, northeast of Tokyo. Cold wind sweeps across the airfield as the first training aircraft begin moving toward the runway. Frost clings to the grass beside the tarmac, while mechanics finish final checks on a line of aging trainers. Inside one cockpit, aviation cadet Hiroshi Tanaka tightens the strap beneath his chin. His hands tremble slightly as the instructor climbs into the rear seat. The aircraft is a Yokosuka K5Y trainer, its radial engine coughing before settling into a steady rumble. Only 2 years earlier, this same training base followed a very different rhythm. Cadets trained here for long periods before reaching operational units. Navigation exercises stretched across entire days. Carrier landing practice continued late into the night. Only the most disciplined pilots graduated. Now the schedule has been cut almost in half. Fuel shortages limit flight hours. Aircraft are worn from constant use. Instructors are under pressure from Naval Command to push students through faster. Tanaka advances the throttle, and the trainer begins rolling down the runway. The aircraft lifts into the cold morning sky. Below him, the airfield grows smaller as he climbs. But the training he receives will never match the preparation that pilots received before the war. At the same moment across the Pacific Ocean, another training program operates on a completely different scale. Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi, Texas. Hundreds of training aircraft fill the sky over the Gulf Coast. Steerman trainers circle the airfield in neat patterns. Instructors guide cadets through landing drills again and again. If a cadet struggles, he repeats the lesson. If he fails, another trainee takes his place. The system never stops. New recruits arrive daily. The United States Navy designed its aviation program for expansion. More runways are built, more instructors assigned. Factories deliver new training aircraft every week. By late 1943, American flight schools graduate thousands of pilots each year. Inside the Japanese training system, instructors face a very different reality. Lieutenant Commander Kenjiro Sato stands beside a chalkboard inside a small classroom at Tsuchiura. He studies the list of students assigned to his squadron. Many arrived only months ago. Their training time is already ending. Soon they will be sent to operational units defending islands across the Pacific. Sato remembers the pilots he trained before the war. Those men practiced formation flying until their movements became instinctive. They fired machine guns at moving targets until every burst struck with deadly accuracy. They performed carrier landings hundreds of times before facing combat. But now there is no time. The war demands pilots immediately. Several new aircraft types have entered Japanese service. The Mitsubishi A-6M50 continues flying from bases across the Pacific. The Nakajima Ki-43 fighter defends Army airfields. Newer aircraft like the Kawanishi N-1K fighter appear in limited numbers. But without experienced pilots, even the best aircraft cannot change the situation. During training flights, Sato notices mistakes that once would have been unacceptable. One cadet struggles with formation spacing. Another lands too fast and damages the landing gear. Under normal circumstances, these cadets would repeat training until they improved. Now they are simply passed forward. The war has become too large, too fast. Across the Pacific, American carrier groups now operate with increasing confidence. New carriers join the fleet every few months. USS Essex, USS Intrepid, USS Lexington Reborn. Each new carrier arrives with fresh squadrons. Inside ready rooms aboard these ships, pilots study attack plans while mechanics prepare aircraft on the flight deck. The pilots are not the same elite veterans who fought at the beginning of the war. Many are young. Some have only recently completed training. But they are supported by a system that constantly replaces losses. If a squadron loses several pilots during a mission, replacements arrive from training bases within weeks. The machine continues operating. Meanwhile, Japanese air units scattered across the Pacific grow weaker. Experienced pilots are spread thin across distant bases. Some defend the Philippines. Others defend island airfields in the Marshalls or the Carolines. Every battle costs more pilots, and fewer replacements arrive. In late 1943, Japanese Naval Command attempts to rebuild its carrier aviation groups. New carriers like Taiho prepare for future operations. But when commanders inspect the available pilots, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The skill level is no longer the same. Many of the veterans who mastered carrier operations during the early war are gone. Their replacements lack the same flight hours. Many have never practiced complex multi-carrier strike coordination. Carrier landings remain dangerous for inexperienced aviators. Every lost aircraft during training reduces the already limited pilot pool. Inside one training hangar at Tsuchiura, Lieutenant Commander Sato speaks quietly with another instructor. "We are sending them to the front too soon," Sato says. The other officer nods slowly. But headquarters demands pilots. Outside the hangar, Tanaka's training aircraft returns from its flight. The landing is rough. The wheels strike the runway harder than expected. The instructor remains silent as the aircraft rolls to a stop. Tanaka removes his helmet and looks out across the airfield. Soon he will be sent to a combat unit somewhere across the Pacific. He has never landed on a carrier. He has never faced enemy fighters. But the war no longer allows time for perfect preparation. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American training bases continue producing new aviators faster every month. Thousands graduate each year. Many will die in combat. But their replacements are already in training. Japan is attempting to rebuild something that required years to create. And the war will not wait for them to succeed. June 19th, 1944. 9:37 a.m. Above the Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands, the sky is bright and cloudless, stretching endlessly above the deep blue ocean. Heat shimmers across the wings of dozens of aircraft climbing away from the flight decks of Japanese carriers below. From the bridge of the carrier, Taiho, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa watches the formation gather through his binoculars. This is supposed to be the moment when Japan's carrier aviation rises again. The combined fleet has assembled its remaining carriers for a massive counterattack against the advancing American fleet threatening the Mariana Islands. 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft. Ozawa hopes this force will restore Japan's air superiority. But even before the strike reaches the enemy, problems begin appearing in the formation. Inside one Mitsubishi, a 6M5, Zero fighter, petty officer, first class Kenji. Takahashi struggles to hold position beside the bombers he is escorting. His aircraft shakes slightly in the warm, rising air. He checks the instruments again. Everything appears normal, but his experience is limited. He has barely 100 hours of flight time before reaching combat. Years earlier, Japanese carrier pilots rarely entered battle with less than 500 hours. Some had more than 700. Those pilots had mastered long-range navigation, complex formation, flying, and carrier operations. But the men flying toward the American fleet now have far less experience. Fuel shortages reduced training. Aircraft shortages reduced practice. The war demanded speed rather than perfection. As the Japanese formation pushes east toward the American fleet, the first signs of trouble appear. Several bombers drift out of formation. Radio calls fill the air as flight leaders attempt to regroup their aircraft. These are mistakes that veteran pilots rarely made. Below the formation, the American fleet waits. Task Force 58, one of the most powerful carrier forces ever assembled. 15 carriers sail in formation beneath the rising sun. USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Bunker Hill, USS Hornet. Each ship launches fighters into the sky. The pilots climbing into those aircraft are not all veterans. Many are newly trained replacements. But their training followed a system designed to produce pilots quickly and consistently. Their aircraft are Grumman F-6F Hellcats, fast, heavily armed, built to fight the Zero on equal terms. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard USS Lexington, radar operators track the incoming Japanese strike. Bright green shapes move slowly across the radar screen, dozens of them. The American response begins immediately. Fighter squadrons are directed toward the incoming formations. High above the ocean, the Hellcats intercept. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu leads one of the American fighter groups. He spots the Japanese formation approaching from the west. The bombers appear scattered. The escorts struggle to maintain coverage. Vratu pushes his throttle forward and dives. The Hellcats tear into the formation. Machine guns flash. Bombers explode in mid-air. Zeros attempt to defend them, but coordination breaks down quickly. Some pilots hesitate during maneuvers. Others lose sight of their squadron leaders. The sky fills with burning aircraft falling toward the ocean. Within minutes, the formation begins collapsing. Japanese pilots struggle to maintain order. Several bombers attempt to continue toward the fleet alone. They are shot down quickly. Only a handful of aircraft manage to approach the American ships. Anti-aircraft fire finishes most of them before they reach bombing range. Inside the Japanese carriers, radio reports begin arriving. Strike group destroyed. Heavy losses. Few aircraft returning. Admiral Ozawa lowers his binoculars slowly. He understands what has just happened. The pilots sent to attack the American fleet were not ready, not trained well enough, not experienced enough. The elite aviators, who once carried Japan's naval air power, are gone. Their replacements cannot fight the same way. Meanwhile, the American fleet continues launching fighters. More Hellcats rise from the carriers. More trained pilots fill the sky. Throughout the day, the pattern repeats itself. Japanese strike groups launch. American fighters intercept. Japanese aircraft fall from the sky. American pilots begin calling the battle something almost unbelievable. The Great Marianas, Turkey shoot. Not because the Japanese pilots lack courage, but because they lack the training and coordination their predecessors once possessed. By the end of the day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft are gone. Many of the pilots flying them never had a real chance. Back on the carrier. Tai-ho, the realization spreads slowly through the command staff. Even if new aircraft are built, even if new carriers enter service, Japan no longer has the trained pilots needed to fight this war in the air. The elite system that once defined Japanese naval aviation cannot survive the losses it has suffered. Across the Pacific, American training programs continue operating without interruption. More pilots graduate every month. More squadrons fill the flight decks of newly built carriers. The war in the air has become a contest of endurance. And in that contest, the balance has shifted permanently. October 25th, 1944. 7:02 a.m. The sky above Leyte Gulf in the Philippine Islands. Low clouds drift across the tropical sky as aircraft engines roar from airfields scattered across Luzon. The morning air vibrates with the sound of dozens of fighters and bombers taking off one after another. Inside the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M50. Ensign Yukio Seki tightens his grip on the control stick. The aircraft climbs slowly into formation with other fighters gathering above the airfield. But this formation is not flying toward a normal mission. Below the aircraft's wings, a 250-kilogram bomb hangs beneath the fuselage. The briefing given to the pilots only hours earlier was brief and direct. The target is the American invasion fleet near Leyte. The mission is one way. There will be no return. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had stood before the assembled pilots the night before. His voice calm, almost gentle, as he explained the situation. Japan no longer possesses enough trained aviators to challenge the American fleet directly. Carrier aviation has been destroyed. Airfields across the Pacific have lost their experienced pilots. American fighters now dominate the skies. The only remaining weapon, he explained, is sacrifice. The special attack units. Kamikaze. Seki had listened silently like the others. Most of the pilots in the room were young. Many had less than 200 hours of flight time. Some had never flown in combat. They were the final generation produced by the accelerated training programs that followed Midway and Guadalcanal. Training had grown shorter each year as Japan struggled to replace its losses. But by 1944, even the shortened system could no longer keep pace. Too many aircraft lost. Too many pilots gone. The carefully trained elite aviators who once dominated the Pacific had disappeared. Now the war required something else, a final measure. As the formation climbs higher above Luzon, Seki glances to his left. Several other Zeros fly in formation beside him. Each carries a bomb. Each pilot understands the mission. They will dive directly into the American ships. Guided missiles with human pilots. Below them, the vast American invasion fleet fills the waters of Leyte Gulf. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, hundreds of ships supporting the landings on the Philippine Islands. But what matters most is not the fleet itself. It is the sky above it. Hundreds of American aircraft patrol the airspace. Fighters circle constantly. Radar stations detect incoming aircraft long before they reach the fleet. And when Japanese formations approach American fighters, intercept them quickly. The American pilots flying those fighters come from a system that never stopped producing replacements. Throughout the war, new pilots continued arriving. Some were veterans by now. Others were fresh graduates from training bases in the United States. But they always arrived. The pipeline never closed. Inside one Grumman F-6F, Hellcat flying patrol above the fleet. Lieutenant James Harris watches the radar-guided intercept vector displayed on his instrument panel. The radio crackles. Enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest. Harris banks his fighter toward the incoming formation. Soon he spots them. Japanese aircraft flying low and fast toward the fleet. He pushes the throttle forward and dives. Machine guns open fire. One Japanese aircraft explodes in the sky. Another turns away, trailing smoke. But several continue flying directly toward the ships. Even when American fighters intercept them, some of the aircraft do not attempt to escape. They dive straight toward the fleet. Below, sailors aboard the escort carrier, USS St. Lo, watch the sky anxiously. Anti-aircraft guns fire continuously. 1-0 breaks through the defensive fire. The aircraft dives steeply. It crashes directly into the carrier's flight deck. The explosion tears through the hangar below. Fuel ignites. Within minutes, fires spread uncontrollably across the ship. USS St. Lo sinks later that day. It becomes the first American carrier destroyed by a kamikaze attack. Across the fleet, more attacks follow in the coming months. Japanese pilots crash their aircraft into destroyers, carriers, and transport ships. Some attacks succeed, others fail. But every mission ends the same way. The pilot does not return. Inside Japanese air bases across the Philippines, instructors continue preparing new pilots for these missions. Training is no longer focused on survival. Carrier landings are no longer necessary. Complex air combat tactics are no longer required. Pilots only need to reach the target once. This is what remains of the once elite aviation force that opened the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The same Navy that once protected its highly trained aviators now sends inexperienced pilots on missions designed not to return. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. It happened gradually. First at Midway, when irreplaceable pilots died with their carriers. Then over Guadalcanal, where experienced aviators were lost faster than they could be replaced. Then over the Philippine Sea, where inexperienced replacements faced overwhelming American air power. And finally, here above Leyte Gulf, where the last pilots take off knowing their training was never meant to win the war, only to delay its end. High above the fleet, Lieutenant Harris watches another kamikaze aircraft plunge into the ocean after being hit by gunfire. More fighters circle overhead. More American pilots arrive from nearby carriers. The sky remains crowded with aircraft. The system that replaced pilots by the thousands continues working exactly as designed. Far to the west at airfields across the Philippines, more Japanese pilots prepare their aircraft. They climb into cockpits built for war. But the war that required skill training and mastery of the air has already been decided.